To get Visual Studio on your machine, simply visit code.visualstudio.com, just as I've done here in my browser. Visual Studio Code is a very powerful and popular code editor. It's completely free and it supports a multitude of programming languages. And as you can see here, it's also available for multiple platforms, Mac OS, Windows, and Linux. One of the really great things about this editor is that it's open source and it has a very active community behind it. And that means that great features and fixes are released every month. And if I scroll to the end of this page, I can see that the number of stars in GitHub, which is basically the number of people who have showed appreciation or like this editor, is quite high. So there's a lot of activity behind this editor. So once you've followed the installation instructions for your platform and you have Visual Studio Code on your machine, launch it. So on this Windows machine, I'll just click on my Visual Studio Code icon, and in a couple of seconds, Visual Studio Code will be launched. You should be presented with a similar welcome screen when you open Visual Studio Code for the first time. And so to get going here, what I'd like to do next is open a file or create a new file. And I can do that here by clicking on New File, or up in the main menu by choosing File, New File, or even using a shortcut. For now, I'll just click on New File, and I'm presented with this new file and this inside the code editor. I'll just paste some HTML in to save some time. And there's some HTML, and so far, nothing too exciting. What we have to do next is help the editor realize that this is HTML, and we do that by naming this file with the HTML extension. So I'll save the file. I'll save it off to my disk, and let me see, HTML, and I'll call this one test.html. Bingo. Once I do that, you can see that the editor has recognized this page as HTML and it's beginning to light up the content. So you can see the nice color coding of the page we get for free out of the box. Let's look at a couple more things we get with this basic support for HTML. If I move my mouse over any tag, I get more information on the symbol under the cursor. So if I roll over HTML, I get some information about that tag, and similarly for a body tag and every other tag or element on this page. And this is great when you're learning the language. If I'm inside my editing my page and I'm editing, if I open an angle bracket, it gives me a list of possible tags I can use. And if I select a tag, for example P, and I close it with an angle bracket, the editor automatically inserts the end tag if one exists or is needed for that particular element, which is really useful too. So there's two more things I can use. Another one is if I'm in my HTML or any other code inside Visual Studio and I want to tidy it up a bit, one thing to try is Shift-Alt-F, and it will prettify or beautify the page a little bit, and that's useful. And on the Mac you can use the same command with Command K, Command F. And so that's just a couple more features that are available out of the box in Visual Studio Code for HTML editing. Of course, it's always nice to see what your HTML code looks like when the page is rendered in a browser. One way to do that is to open the file from the local folder. So if I go to my Windows Explorer and I have my file test.html, I can right click on it and say open with and choose a browser. And as I've done before, I'll choose Microsoft Edge, and there's that file rendered inside the browser. Unfortunately, there is no preview in browser function available by default in Visual Studio Code. Fear not, community to the rescue. As I mentioned earlier, there's a vibrant developer community around this product, and they fill in feature gaps when needed. Visual Studio Code has hundreds of extensions available in the Visual Studio Code marketplace. So let's find an extension to help us preview our HTML in a browser. There are many ways to get to the Visual Studio Code extensions marketplace. One way is to come up here to the View menu and select View Extensions. And a panel is opened beside the editor which will allow us to search for extensions in the marketplace. So here I'll type in the word browser, and we get a lot of different extensions related to browser listed here. I encourage you to look through some of these, look at the ratings, and figure out for yourself which extensions you'd like to install. I'll try this open in browser because I think this is one I've installed previously. Just for demo purposes, I'll install that, and as you can see it says installing, and then reload. I have to click reload to activate this particular extension, and this only takes a couple of moments. And once it's installed, then I go back into my HTML. I can see in the extensions panel here that it says it's installed, which is great. And I believe the command to preview using this extension is Control K and then D. And as you can see, it launches my default browser and it shows me the preview of that page. If I go back to my Visual Studio Code and I change this to be VS Code and I save it and I say Control K D, there you go, it previews. So that's just an example of an extension we can use in order to preview our HTML code in a browser from Visual Studio Code. So that's it. That's a quick lap around Visual Studio Code for HTML editing, and I encourage you to explore the documentation and discover more features of Visual Studio Code.